Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 20 through 28 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F. C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 7. Chapter 20. The counts of indictment, replied the other, are as varied as they are numerous, for your style of dress is assailed in them, and your way of living in general, and your having been worshipped by certain people, and the fact that in Ephesus once you delivered an oracle about the famine, and also that you have uttered certain sentiments to the detriment of the sovereign, some of them openly, some of them obscurely and privately, and some of them on the pretense that you have learned them from heaven. But the charge which most appeals to the credulity of the emperor, although I cannot credit it in the least, for I know that you are opposed even to shedding the blood of victims, is the following. They say that you visited Nerva in the country, and that you cut up an Arcadian boy for him when he was consulting the auspices against the emperor, and that by such rites as these you roused his ambitions, and that all this was done by night, when the moon was already on the wane. This is the accusation, as compared with which we need not consider any other, because it far outweighs them all. For if your accuser attacks your dress and your mode of life, and your gift of foreknowledge, it is only by way, I assure you, of leading up to this charge, and it was moreover the peculiarities which prompted you to commit the crime of conspiring against the emperor, so he says, and emboldening you to offer such a sacrifice. You must then be prepared to defend yourself upon these counts, and I would only ask you in what you say to show great respect for the sovereign. And Apollonius replied, That I shall show no disrespect you may clearly gather from the fact that I am come here to justify myself, and even if my circumstances were such as to embolden me to treat a despot in a haughty manner, I should anyhow submit myself to a man like yourself, who also loves me. For though it does not so much matter if you merely fall into the bad graces of an enemy, for your enemy will hate you not for reasons which make you an object of public suspicion, but for private causes of offense, which you have given them, nothing is graver than to give a friend reason to think ill of you. This is worse than all your enemies put together can effect, for no man can avoid being disliked even by his enemies for his bad qualities. Chapter 21. These words impressed Aelian as very sensible, and he bade him be of good courage, while he himself formed the conviction that here was a man whom nothing could terrify or startle, and who would not flinch even if the head of the Gorgon were brandished over him. He accordingly summoned the jailers who had charge of such cases, and said, My orders are to detain this man until the emperor be informed of his arrival, and learn from his lips all he has to say to me. And he said this with the air of a man very much enraged, and then he went into the palace and began to attend to the duties of his office. At this point, Damis records an incident which in a way resembles, and in a way is unlike, the episode related of Aristides long ago in Athens. For they were ostracizing Aristides because of his virtue, and he had no sooner passed the gates of the city than a rustic came up to him and begged him to fill up his voting shirt against Aristides. The rustic knew no more to whom he was speaking than he knew how to write. He only knew that Aristides was detested because he was so just. Now, on this occasion, a tribune who knew Apollonius perfectly well addressed him and asked him in an insolent manner what had brought him to such a pass. Apollonius replied that he did not know. Said the other, Well, I can tell you, for it is allowing yourself to be worshipped by your fellow men that has led you to be accused of setting yourself on a level with the gods. Asked the other, And who is it that has paid me this worship? Said the other, I myself, when I was still a boy in Ephesus, at a time when you stayed our epidemic. Apollonius said, Lucky it was, both for you and for the city of Ephesus that was saved. Said the other, Well, this is a reason why I have prepared a method of defense for you, which will rid you of the charge against you. For let us go outside the gates, and if I cut your head off with my sword, the accusation will have defeated itself, and you will go scot-free. But if you terrify me to such an extent that I drop my sword, you must needs be thought a divine being, and then it will be seen that there is a basis of truth in the charges made against you. So much coarser and ruder was this fellow than the man who wished to banish Aristides, and he uttered his words with a grimace and mocking laughter. But Apollonius affected not to have heard him, and went on with his conversation with Damis about the Delta, about which they say the Nile is divided into 2 branches. Chapter 22. Aelian next summoned him and ordered him into the prison, where the captives were not bound, until, he said, the emperor shall have leisure, for he desires to talk with you privately before taking any further steps. Apollonius accordingly left the law court and passed into the prison, where he said, Let us talk, Damis, with the people here, for what else is there for us to do until the time comes when the despot will give me such audience as he desires? Damis said, Will they not think us babblers and bores if we interrupt them in the preparation of their defense? And moreover, it is a mistake to talk philosophy with men so broken in spirit as they. Apollonius said, Nay, they are just the people who most want someone to talk to them and comfort them. For you may remember the verses of Homer in which he relates how Helen mingled in the bowl of wine certain drugs from Egypt, in order to drown the heartache of the heroes. Well, I think that Helen must have picked up the lore of the Egyptians, and have sung spells over the dejected heroes through their bowl of wine, so healing them by a blending of words and wine. Damis said, And that is likely enough, seeing that she came to Egypt and consorted with Proteus, or, if we prefer Homer's account, was well acquainted with Polydamna, the daughter of Thon. However, let us dismiss these topics for the moment, for I want to ask you something. Apollonius said, I know what you are going to ask me, for I am sure you wish me to tell you what my conversation was about with the consul, and what he said, and whether he was formidable and severe or gentle to me. And forthwith he told Damis all that had passed. Thereupon Damis prostrated himself before him and said, Now I am ready to believe that Leucothea did really once give her veil to Odysseus, after he had fallen out of his ship, and was paddling himself over the sea with his hands. For we are reduced to just as awful and impossible a plight, when some god, as it seems to me, stretches out his hand over us, that we fall not away from all hope of salvation. But Apollonius disapproved of the way he spoke, and said, How long will you continue to cherish these fears, as if you could never understand that wisdom amazes all that is sensible of her, but is herself not amazed by anything? Damis said, But we are brought here before one who is quite insensible, and who not only cannot be amazed by us, but would not allow anything in the world to amaze him. Apollonius said, Seest thou not, O Damis, that he is maddened with pride and vanity? Said the other, I see it, how can I not? Apollonius said, Well, you have got to despise the despot just in proportion as you get to know him. Chapter 23. They were talking like this, when someone, a Sicilian I think, came up and said, I, gentlemen, am brought to this pass by my wealth. And Apollonius replied, If your wealth was acquired by other than holy methods, for example by piracy and administration of deadly drugs, or by disturbing the tombs of ancient kings which are full of gold and treasure, you deserve not only to be put on your trial, but also to forfeit your life. For these things are wealth, no doubt, but of an infamous and inhuman kind. But if you acquired your wealth by inheritance or by trade dealings of a fair description, and not by usury, who would be so cruel as to deprive you under color of law of what you have acquired with its venerable sanction? Said the other, My property has accrued to me from several of my relations, and has centered itself in my single household, and I use it, not as if it belonged to other people, for it is my own, yet not as my own, for I share it freely with all good men. But the informers accused me of having acquired my wealth to the prejudice of the despot, for they say that if I attempted a revolution, it would supply me with resources, while if I attached myself to another as his accomplice, my wealth would weigh heavily in his favor. And there is actually an oracular air about the charges made against us, such as that all excess of wealth engenders insolence, or that more ordinary wealth makes its owner carry his head too high and rouses in him a spirit of pride, and that it prevents him from being a good subject and obeying the laws and rulers who are sent to the provinces. They say, indeed, that it is very nearly tantamount to giving them a box on the ears, because they grovel to wealthy men or connive at their crime, on account of the influence which wealth gives. Now, when I was a stripling, before I had as much as 100 talents to call my own, I used to think such apprehensions as these ridiculous, and I had small anxiety on the score of my property. But when my paternal uncle died, and in a single day I came in for a reversion of 500 talents, my mind underwent such a change as those who break horses effect, when they cure them of being unruly and intractable. And as my riches increased and flowed in to me by land and by sea, I became so much the slave of anxiety about them, that I poured out my substance, partly upon sycophants, whom I had to flatter in order to stop their mouths by being of such blackmail, and partly upon governors, whose influence I wished to enlist on my side against those who plotted against me, and partly on my kinsmen, to prevent them being jealous of my wealth, and partly on my slaves, for fear they should become worse than they were and complain of being neglected. And I also had to support a magnificent flock of friends, for the latter were full of solicitude for me, and some insisted on helping me with their own hands, and others with their warnings and advice. But although I thus fenced my wealth about, and surrounded myself so securely with fortifications, I now am imperilled by it, and I am not yet sure that I shall escape with my life. And Apollonius answered, Take heart, for you have your wealth to go surety for your life. For if it is your wealth which has led to your being confined in bonds, it is your wealth also which, when it is dissipated, will not only release you from this prison, but from the necessity of cherishing and flattering those sycophants and slaves whose yoke it has imposed upon your neck. Chapter 24. Another man came and said that he was being prosecuted, because at a public sacrifice in Tarentum, where he held office, he had omitted to mention in the public prayers that Domitian was the son of Athena. Said Apollonius, You imagined that Athene could not possibly have a son, because she is a virgin for ever and ever. But you forgot, methinks, that a goddess once on a time bore a dragon to the Athenians. Chapter 25. Another man was confined in the prison on the following charge. He had a property in Acarnania, near the mouth of Achelous, and he had been in the habit of sailing about the islands called the Echinades in a small boat, and he noticed that one of them was already joined to the mainland, and he planted it all over with pleasant trees and vines, producing sweet wine. So he made in it a convenient habitation for himself, for he also brought in water and sufficient quantities for the island from the mainland. In consequence, an accusation was trumped up against him, that he had a guilty conscience, and that it was because he was conscious of having committed crimes of an intolerable description, that he transported himself and quitted his own land, feeling that he polluted it, and at the same time had chosen for himself the same form of release as Alcmaeon, the son of Amphiaraus, had done, when, after his mother's murder, he went and lived on the delta of the Achelous. Even if he had not committed the same crime as Alcmaeon, he must yet, they said, have on his conscience horrible deeds, not falling far short of his. Although he denied these insinuations, and declared that he only went to live there for the sake of peace and quiet, he had nevertheless, he said, been accused and brought to justice, and for this reason he was now cast into prison. Chapter 26. Several prisoners, for there were about 50 of them in this prison, approached Apollonius inside it, and uttered such lamentations as the above. Some of them were sick, some of them had given way to dejection, some of them expected death with certainty and with resignation. Some of them bewailed and called upon their children and their parents and their wives. Whereupon Apollonius said, affected by the spectacle, "O Damis, it seems to me that these people need the drug which I alluded to when I first entered. Whether it be an Egyptian remedy, or whether it grows in every land and only needs wisdom enough to cut it from its root out of her own gardens, let us administer some of it to these poor people, lest their own feelings destroy them before Domitian can do it." Damis said, "Let us do so, for they seem in need of it." Accordingly, Apollonius called them all together and said, "Gentlemen, who are sharing with me the hospitality of this poor roof, I am wrung with pity for you, because I feel that you are undoing yourselves, before you know in the least whether the accuser will undo you. For it seems to me that you are ready to put yourselves to death, and anticipate the death sentence which you expect will be pronounced against you. And so you show actual courage where you should feel fear, and fear where you should be courageous. This should not be, but you should bear in mind the words of Archilochus of Paros, who says that the patience under adversity, which he called endurance, was a veritable discovery of the gods. For it will bear you up in misery, just as a skilful pilot carries the bow of his ship above the wash of the sea, whenever the billows are raised higher than his bark. Nor should you consider as desperate this situation into which you have been brought against your wills, but I myself of my own accord. For if you admit the charges brought against you, you ought rather to deplore the day when your judgment and impulses betrayed you into unjust and cruel courses of action. But if you, my friend yonder, deny that you took up your residence in the island of the Achelos, for the reason which your accuser alleges, and you there, that you ever raised your wealth to the peril and endangering of the sovereignty, and you again, that you of set purpose deprived the sovereign of his pretension to be called the son of Athene, if, I say, you can prove that the several reasons alleged of your being, each of you, here in such perilous plights, are unfounded, what then is the meaning of all this lamentation about things which have no existence or reality? For, instead of crying after your friends and relatives, you ought rather to feel just as much courage as you now feel despair. For such, I imagine, are the rewards of the endurance I have described. But perhaps you would argue that confinement here and life in a prison are hard to bear in themselves. Or do you look upon them as the mere beginning of what you expect to suffer? Or do you think that they are punishment sufficient in themselves, even if you are exposed to nothing else in the way of penalty? Well, I understand human nature, and I will preach you a sermon which is very unlike the prescriptions of physicians, for it shall implant strength in you, and will avert death from you. We men are in a prison all that time, which we choose to call life. For this soul of ours, being bound and fettered in a perishable body, has to endure many things, and be the slave of all the affections which visit humanity. And the men who first invented a dwelling seem to me not to have known that they were only surrounding their kind in a fresh prison. For, to tell you the truth, all those who inhabit palaces and have established themselves securely in them are, I consider, in closer bonds in them than any whom they may throw into bonds. And when I think of cities and walls, it seems to me that these are common prisons, so that the merchants are in chains no less, the members of the assembly, and the frequenters also of spectacles, as well as those who organize public processions. Then there are the Scythians who go about upon wagons, They are just as much in chains as ourselves, for rivers like the Ister and the Thermodon and the Tanais hem them in, and they are very difficult to cross, except when they are hard frozen. And they fix up their houses on their wagons, and they imagine they are driving about, when they are merely cowering in them. And if you don't think it too silly a thing to say, there are those who teach that the ocean also encompasses the earth in order to chain it in. Come, O ye poets, for this is your domain. Recite your rhapsodies to this despondent crowd, and tell them how Kronos was once put in bonds by the wiles of Zeus. And Ares, the most warlike of the gods, was first enchanted in heaven by Hephaestus, and later upon earth by the sons of Alois. When we think of these things and reflect on the many wise and blessed men who have been thrown into prison by wanton mobs, or insulted by despots, let us accept our fate with resignation, that we may not be found inferior to those who have accepted the same before us. Such were the words which he addressed to his companions in the prison, and they had such an effect upon them that most of them took their food and wiped away their tears, and walked in hope, believing that they could never come to harm as long as they were in his company. Chapter 27. On the next day he was haranguing them in a discourse of the same tenor, when a man was sent into the prison privately by Domitian to listen to what he said. In his deportment this person had a downcast air, and, as he himself admitted, looked as if he ran a great risk. He had great volubility of speech, as is usually the case with sycophants who have been chosen to draw up 8 or 10 informants. Apollonius saw through the trick, and talked about themes which could in no way serve his purpose, for he told his audience about rivers and mountains, and he described wild animals and trees to them, so that they were amused, while the informer gained nothing to his purpose. And when he tried to draw him away from these subjects and get him to abuse the tyrant, Apollonius said, "My good friend, you say what you like, for I am the last man in the world to inform against you. But if I find anything to blame in the emperor, I'll say it to his face." Chapter 28. There followed other episodes in this prison, some of them insidiously contrived, and others mere chance, and not of sufficient importance to merit any notice. But Damis, I believe, has recorded them in his anxiety to omit nothing. I only give what is to the point. It was evening, and it was already the 5th day of his imprisonment, when a certain person entered the prison, who spoke the Hellenic tongue, and said, "Where is the man of Tyana?" And taking Apollonius aside, he said, "It is tomorrow that the emperor will give you an audience." And this he appeared to have heard direct from Aelian. "I will keep your secret," said Apollonius, "for it is only Aelian, I think, who can know so much." Said the other, "Moreover, word has been given to the chief jailer to supply you with everything which you may want." Apollonius said, "You are very kind, but I lead exactly the same life here as I would outside, for I converse about casual topics, and I do not need anything." "And do you not, O Apollonius, need someone to advise you how to converse with the emperor?" He replied, "Yes, by heaven, if only he will not try to get me to flatter him." "And what if he merely advised you not to slight him nor flout him?" Apollonius said, "He could give no better advice, and it is what I have made up my mind to do." Said the other, "Well, it was about this that I am come, and I am delighted to find you so sensibly disposed, but you ought to be prepared for the way in which the emperor speaks, and also for the disagreeable quality of his face, for he talks in a deep voice, even if he is merely engaged in a gentle conversation, and his eyebrows overhang the sockets of his eyes, and his cheeks are so bloated with bile, that this distinguishes him more than anything else. We must not be frightened, O man of Tyana, by these characteristics, for they rather belong to nature than to anything else, and they always are the same." And Apollonius replied, If Odysseus could go into the cave of Polyphemus without having been informed beforehand either of the giant's size, or what he ate, or of how he thundered his voice, and yet did not lose his presence of mind, though he was in some trepidation to begin with, and if he left his cave after acquitting himself like a man, I too shall be quite satisfied if I get off with my own life and with that of my companions, in whose behalf I incur this risk. Such were the words that passed between him and his visitor, and after reporting them to Damis, he went to sleep. End of Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 20 through 28. Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 29 through 38 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F. C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 7. Chapter 29. And about dawn a notary came from the royal court, and said, It is the emperor's orders, O Apollonius, that you should repair to his court at the time when the marketplace is full, not indeed as yet to make your defense, for he wants to see you and find out who you are, and to talk with you alone. Apollonius said, And why do you trouble me with these details? Are you not then Apollonius? Said the other. He said, Yes, by heaven, and of Tyana too. Said the other, To whom, then, should I give this message? He replied, To those who will take me thither, for I suppose that I shall have to get out of this prison somehow. Replied the other, Orders have already been given to them, and I will come here in good time, and I only came to give you the message now, because the orders were issued late last night. Chapter 30. He accordingly went away, but Apollonius, after resting himself a little while on his bed, said, Damis, I need sleep, for I have had a bad night trying to remember what Phraotes once told me. Said the other, Well, if you had to keep awake, you had much better have occupied yourself in preparing for so great an occasion as now is announced to you. Apollonius said, And how could I prepare myself, when I do not even know what questions he will ask of me? Damis said, Then are you going to defend your life extempore? He replied, Yes, by heaven, for it is an extempore life that I have always led. But I want to tell you what I could remember of the conversation of Phraotes, for I think you will find it very profitable under the circumstances. Phraotes enjoined the tamers of lions not to strike them, for he said that they bear you a grudge if they are struck, but also not to flatter them, because that tends to make them proud and fierce. But he advised them rather to stroke them with the hand at the same time that they threatened them, as the best way of reducing them to obedience and docility. Well, he made these remarks not really about lions, for we were not interested about how to keep lions and wild beasts, but he was really supplying a curb and rein for tyrants of such a kind as he thought would in practice keep them within the lines of good sense and moderation. Damis said, This story is indeed most apposite to the manners of tyrants. But there is also a story in Aesop about a certain lion who lived in a cave, and Aesop says that he was not sick, but only pretended to be so, and that he seized on other wild animals who went to visit him. And accordingly the fox made the remark, What are we to do with him? For no one ever quits his residence, nor are any tracks to be seen of his visitors going out again. And Apollonius remarked, Well, as for myself, I should have regarded your fox as a cleverer animal if he had gone in to see the lion, and instead of being caught, had issued from the cave safely and left clear tracks behind him. Chapter 31. After making this remark, he took a short nap, just enough to close his eyes, and when day came, he offered his prayers to the sun as best he could in prison, and then he conversed with all who came up and asked him questions. And so, about the time when the market fills, a notary came, and ordered him to repair at once to the court, adding, Lest we should not get there in time for the summons into his presence. And Apollonius said, Let us go, and eagerly went forth. And on the way 4 bodyguards followed him, keeping at a greater distance from him than would an escort appointed merely to guard him. And Damis also followed in his train, in some trepidation indeed, but apparently plunged in thought. Now the eyes of all were turned upon Apollonius, for not only were they attracted by his dress and bearing, but there was a god-like look in his eyes, which struck them with astonishment, and moreover, the fact that he had come to Rome to risk his life for his friends conciliated the good wishes even of those who were evilly disposed to him before. When he halted at the palace and beheld the throng of those who were either being courted or were courting their superiors, and heard the din of those who were passing in and out, he remarked, "It seems to me, O Damis, that this place resembles a bath, for I see people outside hastening in, and those within hastening out, and some of them resemble people who have been thoroughly well washed, and others those who have not been washed at all." This saying is the inviolable property of Apollonius, and I wish it to be reserved to him, and not ascribed to this man and that, for it is so thoroughly and genuinely his that he has repeated it in one of his letters. There he saw a very old man who was trying to get an appointment, and in order to do so was groveling before the emperor and fawning upon him. He said, "Here is one, O Damis, whom not even Sophocles, so far, has been able to persuade to run away from a master who is raging mad." Damis said, "Yes, a master that we ourselves, Apollonius, have chosen for our own, for that is why we are standing here at such gates as these." Said the other, "It seems to me, O Damis, that you imagine Aeacus to be warden of these gates, as he is said to be of the gates of Hades, for verily you look like a dead man." Damis said, "Not dead yet, but shortly to be so." And Apollonius answered, "O Damis, you do not seem to me to take very kindly to death, although you have been with me some time and have studied philosophy from your first youth. But I had imagined that you were prepared for it, and had also acquainted yourself with all the strategy and tactical resources that I have at my command. For just as men in battle, no matter how heavily armored they may be, require not merely pluck, but also a knowledge of tactics to interpret to them the right opportunities of battle, so also philosophers must wait for the right opportunities when to die, so that they may not be taken off their guard, nor like suicides rush into death, but may meet their enemies upon ground of their own good choosing. But that I made my choice well of a moment to die in, and found an occasion worthy of a philosopher, supposing anyone wants to kill him, I have both proved to others before whom I defended myself in your presence, and am tired of teaching yourself the same." Chapter 32. So far these matters then. But when the emperor had leisure, having got rid of all his urgent affairs, to give an audience to our sage, the attendants, whose office it was, conducted him into the palace, without allowing Damis to follow him. And the emperor was wearing a wreath of green leaves, for he had just been offering a sacrifice to Athene in the hall of Adonis, and this hall was bright with baskets of flowers, such as the Syrians at the time of the festival of Adonis make up in his honor, growing them under their very roofs. Though the emperor was engaged with his religious rites, he turned round, and was so much struck by Apollonius's appearance that he said, "O Aelian, it is a demon that you have introduced to me." But Apollonius, without losing his composure, made free to comment upon the emperor's words, and said, "As for myself, I imagined that Athene was your tutelary goddess, O sovereign, in the same way as she was Diomedes long ago in Troy. For she removed the mist which dulls the eyes of men from those of Diomede, and endows them with the faculty of distinguishing gods from men. But the goddess has not yet purged your eyes as she did his, my sovereign, yet it were well, if Athene did so, that you might behold her more clearly and not confuse mere men from the forms of demons." Said the emperor, "And you, O philosopher, when did you have this mist cleared away from your eyes?" Said he, "Long ago, and ever since I have been a philosopher." Said the emperor, "How comes it, then, that you have come to regard as gods persons who are most hostile to myself?" Said Apollonius, And what hostility is there between yourself and Iarchus or Phraotes, both of them Indians, and the only human beings that I regard as gods and meriting such a title? Said the emperor, Don't try to put me off with Indians, but just tell me about your darling Nerva and his accomplices. Said Apollonius, Am I to plead his cause, or— No, you shall not plead it, said the emperor, for he has been taken red-handed in guilt. But just prove to me, if you can, that you are not yourself equally guilty as being privy to his designs. Said Apollonius, If you would hear how far I am in his counsel and privy to his designs, please hear me, for why should I conceal the truth? Now the emperor imagined that he was going to hear Apollonius confess very important secrets, and that whatever transpired would conduce to the destruction of the persons in question. Chapter 33. But Apollonius, seeing him on tiptoe with expectation, merely said, For myself, I know Nerva to be the most moderate of men, and the gentlest and the most devoted to yourself, as well as a good ruler, though he is so averse to meddling in high matters of state that he shrinks from office. And as for his friends, for I suppose you refer to Rufus and Orphetus, these men also are discreet, so far as I know, and averse from wealth, somewhat sluggish to do all they lawfully may, while, as for revolution, they are the last people in the world either to plan it or to take part with another who should do so. But the emperor was inflamed with anger at what he heard, and said, Then you mean to say that I am guilty of slander in their cases, since you assert that they are good men, only sluggish, whom I have ascertained to be the vilest of mankind and usurpers of my throne. For I imagine that they too, if I put the question to them about you, would in their turn deny that you are a wizard, and a hothead, and a braggart, and a miser, and that you looked down on the laws. And so it is, you accursed rascals, that you all hold together like thieves. But the accusation shall unmask everything, for I know, as well as if I had been present and taken part in everything, all the oaths which you took, and the objects for which you took them, and when you did it, and what was your preliminary sacrifice. At all this, Apollonius did not even blench, but merely remarked, It is not creditable to you, O sovereign, nor is it congruous with the law, that you should either pretend to try a case affecting persons about whom you have already made up your mind, or should have made it up before ever you have tried them. But if you will have it so, permit me at once to begin and plead my defense. You are prejudiced against me, my sovereign, and you do me a greater wrong than could any false informer, for you take for granted, before you hear them, accusations which he only offers to prove. The emperor said, Begin your defense at any point you like, but I know very well where to draw the line, and with what it is best to begin. Chapter 34. From that moment he began to insult the sage by cutting off his beard and hair, and confining him among the vilest felons. And as regards his hair being shaved, Apollonius remarked, I had forgotten, O sovereign, that it was treasonable to wear long hair. And as regards his imprisonment in bounds, he remarked, If you think me a wizard, how will you ever fetter me? And if you fetter me, how can you say that I am a wizard? Replied the emperor, Yes, for I will not release you until you have turned into water, or some wild animal, or into a tree. Apollonius said, I will not turn into these things, even if I could, for I will not ever betray men who, in violation of all justice, stand in peril, and what I am, that I will remain. But I am ready to endure all you can inflict upon my vile body, until I have finished pleading the cause of these persons. Asked the emperor, And who is going to plead your cause? Apollonius replied, Time and the spirit of the gods, and the passion for wisdom which animates me. Chapter 35. Such was the prelude of his defense, which he made in private to Domitian, as Damis outlines it. But some have, out of malignity, perverted the facts, and say that he first made his defense and only then was imprisoned, at the same time that he was also shorn. And they have also forged a letter in the Ionic dialect of tedious prolixity, in which they pretend that Apollonius went down on his knees to Domitian, and besought him to release him of his bonds. Now Apollonius, it is true, wrote his testament in the Ionic style of language, but I never met with any letter of his composed in that dialect, although I have come across a great many of them. Nor did I ever find any verbosity in any letter of the sages, for they are laconically brief, as if they had been unwound from the ferrule of a herald. Moreover, he won his cause and quitted the court, so how could he ever have been imprisoned after the verdict was given? But I must defer to relate what happened in the law court. I had best narrate first what ensued after he was shaved, and what he said in his discourses, for it is worthy of notice. Chapter 36. For after the sage had been confined for 2 days in prison, someone came to the prison, and said that he had purchased the right to visit him, and that he was come to advise him how to save his life. This person then was a native of Syracuse, and was mind and mouthpiece of Domitian, and he had been suborned, like the earlier one, by him. But he had a more plausible mission, for whereas the first one beat about the bush, this one took up his parable straight from what he saw before him, and said, "Heavens, who would ever have thought of Apollonius being thrown into chains?" Apollonius said, "The person who threw him, for surely he would not have done so if he had not thought of it. And who ever thought that his ambrosial locks could be cut off?" Said Apollonius, "I myself who wore them." "And how can you endure it?" said the other. "As a man well may bear it who is brought to this pass neither with nor without his will." "And how can your leg endure the weight of the fetters?" Said Apollonius, "I don't know, for my mind is intent upon other matters." Said the other, "And yet the mind must attend to what causes pain." Said Apollonius, "Not necessarily, for if you are a man like myself, your mind will either not feel the pain, or will order it to cease." "And what is it that occupies your mind?" Answered Apollonius, "The necessity of not noticing such things." Then the other reverted to the matter of his locks, and led the conversation round to them again, whereupon Apollonius remarked, "It is lucky for you, young man, that you were not one of the Achaeans long ago in Troy, for it seems to me that you would have raised a terrible hullabaloo over the locks of Achilles, when he cut them off in honor of Patroclus, supposing he really did so, and you would at least have swooned at such a spectacle. For if, as you say, you are full of pity for my locks, which were all grey and frowsy, what would you not have felt over those of Achilles, which were nicely curled and auburn?" The other, of course, had only made his remarks out of malice, in order to see what would make Apollonius wince, and, by heaven, to see whether he would reproach his sovereign on account of his sufferings. But he was so shut up by the answers he got that he said, "You have inured the royal displeasure on several grounds, but in particular on those for which Nerva and his friends are being prosecuted, namely, of injuring the government. For certain informations have been conveyed to him about your words in Ionia, when you spoke of him in hostile and embittered tones. But they say that he attaches little importance to that matter, because his anger is whetted by the graver charges, and this, although the informer from whom he learnt these first charges is a very distinguished person of great reputation." Said Apollonius, "A new sort of Olympic winner is this you tell me of, that pretends to win distinction by the weightiness of his slanders. But I quite realize that he is Euphrates, who, I know, does everything against me which he can, and these are far from being the worst injuries which he has done to me. For hearing, once on a time, that I was about to visit the naked sages of Ethiopia, he set himself to poison their minds against me, and if I had not seen through his malignant designs, I should probably have gone away without even seeing their company. The Syracusan then, much astonished at this remark, said, "Then you think it a much lesser thing to be traduced to the emperor than to forfeit your good repute in the eyes of the naked sages, owing to the insinuations dropped against you by Euphrates?" He said, "Yes, by heaven, for I was going there as a learner, whereas I am come here with a mission to teach." "And what are you going to teach?" said the other. Said Apollonius, "That I am a good and honorable man, a circumstance this of which the emperor is not yet aware." Said the other, "But you can get out of your scrape if you only will teach him things which, if you had told him before you came here, you would never have been cast into prison." Now Apollonius understood that the Syracusan was trying to drive him into some such admission as the emperor had tried to get out of him, and that he imagined out of sheer weariness of his imprisonment he would tell some falsehood to the detriment of his friends, and accordingly he answered, "My excellent friend, if I had been cast into prison for telling Domitian the truth, what would happen to me if I refrained from telling it? For he apparently regards truth as something to be punished without imprisonment, just as I regard falsehood." Chapter 37. The Syracusan accordingly was so much struck with the superiority of his philosophical talent, for after saying this he went away, that he promptly left the prison. But Apollonius, glancing at Damis, said, "Do you understand this Python?" Said he, "I understand that he has been suborned to trip you up. But what you mean by Python, and what is the sense of such a name, I do not know." Apollonius replied, "Python of Byzantium was, they say, a rhetor skillful to persuade men to evil courses. He was sent in the interests of Philip, son of Amyntas, on an embassy to the Hellenes to urge their enslavement, and though he passed by other states, he was careful to go to Athens, just at a time when rhetoric most flourished there. And he told them that they did a great injury to Philip, and made a great mistake in trying to liberate the Hellenic nation. Python delivered these sentiments, as they say, with a flood of words, but no one save Demosthenes of the Paeanian deme spoke to the contrary and checked his presumption, and he reckons it amongst his achievements that he bore the brunt of his attack unaided. Now, I would never call it an achievement that I refused to be drawn into the avowals which he wanted. Nevertheless, I said that he was employed on the same job as Python, because he has come here as a despot's hireling to tender me monstrous advice. Chapter 38. Damis says then that though Apollonius uttered many more discourses of the same kind, he was himself in despair of the situation, because he saw no way out of it except such as the gods have vouchsafed to some in answer to prayer when they were in even worse straits. But a little before midday he tells us that he said, "O man of Tyana," for he took a special pleasure, it appears, in being called by that name, "what is to become of us?" "Why, what has become of us already," said Apollonius, "and nothing more, for no one is going to kill us." Damis said, "And who is so invulnerable as that? But will you ever be liberated?" Said Apollonius, "So far as it rests with the verdict of the court, I shall be set at liberty this day, but so far as depends upon my own will, now and here." And with these words he took his leg out of the fetters, and remarked to Damis, "Here is proof positive to you of my freedom, so cheer up." Damis says that it was then for the first time that he really and truly understood the nature of Apollonius, to wit, that it was divine and superhuman, for without any sacrifice, and how in prison could he have offered any? And without a single prayer, without even a single word, he quietly laughed at the fetters, and then inserted his leg in them afresh, and behaved like a prisoner once more. End of Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 29 through 38. Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 39 through 42 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F.C. Conybeare, Volume 2, Book 7. Chapter 39. Now, simple-minded people attribute such acts as this to wizardry, and they make the same mistake in respect of many purely human actions. For athletes resort to this art, just as do all who have to undergo a contest in their eagerness to win, and although it contributes nothing to their success, nevertheless these unfortunate people, after winning by mere chance as they generally do, rob themselves of the credit, and attribute it to this art of wizardry. Nor does any amount of failure in their enterprise shake their faith in it. They merely say such things as this: "If I had only offered this sacrifice or that, if I had only burnt that perfume in place of another, I should not have failed to win." And they really believe what they say. Magic also besieges the doors of merchants no less, for we shall find them too attributing their successes in trade to the wizard or magician, no less than they ascribe their losses to their own parsimony, and their failure to sacrifice as often as they should have done. But it is especially lovers who are addicted to this art, for as the disease which they suffer from in any case renders them liable to be deluded, so much so that they go to old hags to talk about it, it is no wonder, I think, that they resort to these impostors and give ear to their quackeries. They will accept from them a box with stones in it, which they are to wear, some of the bits of stone having come from the depths of the earth, and others from the moon and the stars. And then they are given all the spices which the gardens of India yield, and the cheats exact vast sums of money from them for all this, and yet do nothing to help them at all. For let their favorites only give them the least encouragement, or let the attractions of the lover's presence advance his suit in the very least, and he at once sets out to laud the art as able to achieve everything, while, if the experiment does not come off, he is as ready as ever to lay the blame on some omission, for he will say that he forgot to burn this spice, or to sacrifice or melt up that, and that everything turned upon that, and it was impossible to do without it. Now, the various devices and artifices by which they work signs from heaven, and all sorts of other miracles on a wide scale, have been actually recorded by certain authors, who laugh outright at the art in question. But for myself, I would only denounce such arts in order to prevent young men from resorting to its professors, lest they become accustomed to such things even in fun. This digression has led me far enough from my subject, for why should I attack any further a thing which is equally condemned by nature and by law? Chapter 40. After Apollonius had thus revealed himself to Damis and held some further conversation, about midday someone presented himself to them and made the following intimation verbally: "The Emperor, Apollonius, releases you from these fetters by the advice of Aelian, and he permits you to take up your quarters in the prison where criminals are not bound, until the time comes for you to make your defense. But you will probably be called upon to plead your case 5 days from now." Apollonius said, "Who, then, is to get me out of this place?" The messenger said, "I, so follow me." And when the prisoners in the free prison saw him again, they all flocked round him, as around one restored to them against all expectations. For they entertained the same affectionate longing for Apollonius as children do for a parent who devotes himself to giving them good advice in an agreeable and modest manner, or who tells them stories of his own youth. Nor did they try to hide their feelings, and Apollonius continued incessantly to give them advice. Chapter 41. And on the next day he called Damis and said, "My defense has to be pleaded by me on the day appointed. So do you betake yourself in the direction of Dicaearchia, for it is better to go by land. And when you have saluted Demetrius, turn aside to the seashore where the island of Calypso lies, for there you shall see me appear to you." Damis asked, "Alive, or how?" Apollonius, with a smile, replied, as I myself believe, alive, but as you will believe, risen from the dead. Accordingly, he says that he went away with much regret, for although he did not quite despair of his master's life, yet he hardly expected him to escape death. And on the third day he arrived at Dicaearchia, where he at once heard news of the great storm which had raged during those days. For a gale of rain had burst over the sea, sinking some of the ships that were sailing thither, and driving out of their course those which were tending to Sicily and the straits of Messina. And then he understood why it was that Apollonius had bidden him go by land. Chapter 42. The events which followed are related by Damus, he says, from accounts given by Apollonius, both to himself and Demetrius. For he relates that there came to Rome from Messina in Arcadia a youth remarkable for his beauty, and found there many admirers, and above all Domitian, whose rivals even the former did not scruple to declare themselves, so strong was their attachment. The youth, however, was too high-principled and respected his honor. Now, had it been gold that he scorned, or possessions, or horses, or such other attractions and lures as sundry persons seek to corrupt young people with, we had no call to praise him, for the seducer can hardly dispense with such preparations. But he was tempted with larger honors than all those put together who ever attracted the glances of sovereigns, yet disdained them all for himself. In consequence, he was cast into prison by his own admirers' orders. He came up to Apollonius, and made as if he would speak to him, but, being counseled by his modesty to keep silent, did not venture to. Apollonius noticed this, and said, "You are confined here, and yet are not of an age to be a malefactor, like ourselves who are hardened sinners." Said the other, "Yes, and I shall be put to death, for by our latter-day laws self-respect is honored with capital punishment." Apollonius answered, "So it was in the time of Theseus, for Hippolytus was murdered by his own sire for the same reason." Said the other, "And I too am my own father's victim, for though I am an Arcadian from Messina, he did not give me a Hellenic education, but sent me here to study law, and when I had come here for that purpose, the emperor cast an evil eye on me." But Apollonius feigned not to understand what he meant, and said, "Tell me, boy, surely the emperor does not imagine you have blue eyes when you have, as I see, black ones, or that you have a crooked nose, whereas it is square and regular, like that of a well-executed Hermes? Or has he not made some mistake about your hair? For methinks it is sunny and gleaming, and your mouth too is regular, that whether you are silent or talking, it is equally comely, and you carry your head freely and proudly. Surely the emperor must be mistaking all these traits for others, or you would not tell me he cast an evil eye on you." Said the other, "This is just what has ruined me, for he has condescended to favor me, and instead of sparing what he praises, is prepared to insult me as a woman's lovers might." Apollonius admired the Arcadian too much to ply him with any further questions, as he noticed that he blushed and was most decorous in his language. So he only put to him the question, "Have you any slaves in Arcadia?" "Why, yes, many," replied the lad. Apollonius said, "What relation to them do you consider yourself as holding?" He replied, "That which the laws assign to me, for I am their master." And must slaves obey their masters, or disdain the wishes of those who are masters of their persons? The other discerned the drift of his question, and answered, "I know indeed how irresistible and harsh is the power of tyrants, for they are inclined to use it to overpower even free men. But I am master of my person, and shall guard it inviolate." Apollonius said, "How can you do that? For you have to do with an admirer who is prepared to run amuck of your youth, sword in hand." "I shall simply hold out my neck, which is all his sword requires." Whereupon Apollonius commended him, and said, I perceive you are an Arcadian. Moreover, he mentions this youth in one of his letters, and gives a much more attractive account of him than I have done in the above, and while praising him for his high principles to his correspondent, adds that he was not put to death by the tyrant. On the contrary, after exciting admiration by his firmness, he returned by ship to Malea, and was held in more honor by the inhabitants of Arcadia than the youths who among the Lacedaemonians surpassed their fellows in their endurance of the scourge. End of Volume 2, Book 7, Chapters 39 through 42. Volume 2, Book 8, Chapters 1 through 6 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F. C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 8. Chapter 1. Let us now repair to the law court to listen to the sage pleading his cause, for it is already sunrise, and the doors are thrown open to admit the celebrities. And the companions of the emperor say that he had taken no food that day, because, I imagine, he was so absorbed in examining the documents of the case. For they say he was holding in his hands a roll of writing of some sort, sometimes reading it with anger, and sometimes more calmly. And we must needs figure him as one who was angry with the law for having invented such things as courts of justice. Chapter 2. But Apollonius, as we meet him in this conjuncture, seems to regard the trial as a dialectical discussion, rather than as a race to be run for his life. And this we may infer from the way he behaved before he entered the court. For on his way thither he asked the secretary who was conducting him where they were going, and when the latter answered that he was leading him to the court, he said, "Whom am I going to plead against?" Said the other, "Why, against your accuser, of course, and the emperor will be judge." Said Apollonius, "And who is going to be the judge between myself and the emperor? For I shall prove that he is wronging philosophy." Said the other, "And what concern has the emperor for philosophy, even if he does happen to do her wrong?" Apollonius said, "Nay, but philosophy is much concerned about the emperor, that he should govern as he should." The secretary commended this sentiment, for indeed he was already favorably disposed to Apollonius, as he proved from the very beginning. "And how long will your pleading last by the water clock's reckoning? For I must know this before the trial begins." Apollonius said, "If I am allowed to plead as long as the necessities of the suit require me to, the whole of the Tiber might run through the meter before I should have done. But if I am only to answer all the questions put to me, then it depends on the cross-examiner how long I shall be making my answers." Remarked the other, "You have cultivated contrary talents when you thus engage to talk about one and the same matter both with brevity and with prolixity." Apollonius said, "They are not contrary talents, but resemble one another, for an expert in the one would never be far to seek in the other. And moreover, there is a mean composed of the two, which I should not myself allege to be a third, but a first requisite of a pleader. And for my own part, I am sure that silence constitutes a fourth excellence, much required in a law court. Anyhow," said the other, "it will do you no good nor anyone else who stands in great peril." Said Apollonius, "And yet it was of great service to Socrates of Athens when he was prosecuted." Said the other, "And what good did it do him, seeing that he died just because he would say nothing?" Apollonius said, "He did not die, though the Athenians thought he did." Chapter 3. This was how he prepared himself to confront the despot's maneuvers. And as he waited before the court, another secretary came up and said, "Man of Tyana, you must enter the court with nothing on you." Apollonius said, "Are we then to take a bath or to plead?" Said the other, "The rule does not apply to dress, but the emperor only forbids you to bring in here either amulet or book or any papers of any kind." Apollonius said, and not even a cane for the back of the idiots who gave him such advice as this?" Whereat his accuser burst into shouts. He said, "Oh, my emperor, this wizard threatens to beat me, for it was I who gave you this advice." Apollonius said, "Then it is you who are a wizard rather than myself, for you say that you have persuaded the emperor of my being that which so far I have failed to persuade him that I am not." While the accuser was indulging in this abuse, one of the freedmen of Euphrates was at his side, whom the latter was said to have sent from Ionia with news of what Apollonius had there said in his conversations, and also with a sum of money which was presented to the accuser. Chapter 4. Such were the preliminary skirmishes which preceded the trial. But the conduct of the trial itself was as follows. The court was fitted up as if for an audience listening to a panegyrical discourse, and all the illustrious men of the city were present at the trial, because the emperor was intent upon proving before as many people as possible that Apollonius was an accomplice of Nerva and his friends. Apollonius, however, ignored the emperor's presence so completely as not even to glance at him, and when his accuser upbraided him for want of respect, and bade him turn his eyes upon the God of all mankind, Apollonius raised his eyes to the ceiling, by way of giving a hint that he was looking up to Zeus, and that he regarded the recipient of such profane flattery as worse than he who administered it. Whereupon the accuser began to bellow, and spoke somewhat as follows. "'Tis time, my sovereign, to apportion the water, for if you allow him to talk as long as he chooses, he will choke us. Moreover, I have a roll here which contains the heads of the charges against him, and to these he must answer, so let him defend himself against them one by one." Chapter 5. The emperor approved this plan of procedure, and ordered Apollonius to make his defense according to the informer's advice. However, he dropped out other accusations as not worth discussion, and confined himself to 4 questions which he thought were embarrassing and difficult to answer. He said, "What induces you, Apollonius, to dress yourself differently from everybody else, and to wear this peculiar and singular garb?" Apollonius said, "Because the earth which feeds me also clothes me, and I do not like to bother the poor animals." The emperor next asked the question, "Why is it that men call you a god?" Apollonius answered, "Because every man that is thought to be good is honored by the title of god." I have shown in my narrative of India how this tenet passed into our hero's philosophy. The third question related to the plague in Ephesus. He said, "What motived or suggested your prediction to the Ephesians that they would suffer from a plague?" He said, "I used, O my sovereign, a lighter diet than others, and so I was the first to be sensible of the danger. And if you like, I will enumerate the causes of pestilences." But the emperor, fearful, I imagine, lest Apollonius should reckon among the causes of such epidemics his own wrongdoing, and his incestuous marriage, and his other misdemeanors, replied, "Oh, I do not want any such answer as that." And when he came to the 4th question, which related to Nerva and his friends, instead of hurrying straight on to it, he allowed a certain interval to elapse, and after long reflection, and with the air of one who felt dizzy, he put the question in a way which surprised them all, for they expected him to throw off all disguise and blurt out the names of the persons in question without any reserve, complaining loudly and bitterly of the sacrifice. But instead of putting the question in this way, he beat about the bush and said, "Tell me, you went out of your house on a certain day, and you traveled into the country and sacrificed the boy. I would like to know for whom." And Apollonius, as if he were rebuking a child, replied, "Good words, I beseech you. But if I did leave my house, I was in the country. And if this was so, then I offered the sacrifice. And if I offered it, then I ate of it. But let these assertions be proved by trustworthy witnesses." Such a reply on the part of the sage aroused louder applause than beseemed by the court of an emperor, and the latter, deeming the audience to have borne witness in favor of the accused, and also not a little impressed himself by the answers he had received, for they were both firm and sensible, said, "I acquit you of the charges, but you must remain here until we have had a private interview." Thereat Apollonius was much encouraged, and said, "I thank you indeed, my sovereign, but I would fain tell you that, by reason of these miscreants, your cities are in ruin, and the islands full of exiles, and the mainland of lamentations, and your armies of cowardice, and the senate of suspicion. Accord me also, if you will, opportunity to speak, but if not, then send someone to take my body, for my soul you cannot take. Nay, you cannot take even my body. For thou shalt not slay me, since I tell thee I am not mortal." And with these words he vanished from the court, which was the best thing he could do under the circumstances, for the emperor clearly intended not to question him sincerely about the case, but about all sorts of irrelevant matters, for he took great credit to himself for not having put Apollonius to death, nor was the latter anxious to be drawn into such discussions, and he thought that he would best effect his end if he left no one in ignorance of his true nature, but allowed it to be known to all to be such that he had it in him never to be taken prisoner against his own will. Moreover, he had no longer any cause for anxiety about his friends, for as the despot had not the courage to ask any questions about them, how could he possibly put them to death with any color of justice upon charges which, in court, he had accorded no credence whatever? Such was the account of the proceedings of the trial which I found. Chapter 6. But inasmuch as he had composed an oration which he would have delivered by the clock in defense of himself, only the tyrant confined him to the questions which I have enumerated, I have determined to publish this oration also. For I am well aware, indeed, that those who highly esteem the style of buffoons will find fault with it, as being less chaste and severe in its style than they consider it should be, and as too bombastic in language and tone. However, when I consider that Apollonius was a sage, it seems to me that he would have unworthily concealed his true character if he had merely studied symmetry of endings and antitheses, clicking his tongue as if it had been a castanet. For these tricks suit the genius of rhetoricians, though they are not necessary even to them. For forensic art, if it be too obvious, is apt to betray him who resorts to it as anxious to impose upon the judges, whereas, if it is well concealed, it is likely to carry off a favorable verdict. For true cleverness consists in concealing from the judges the very cleverness of the pleader. But when a wise man is defending his cause, and I need not say that a wise man will not arraign another for faults which he has the will and strength to rebuke, he requires quite another style than that of the hacks of the law court, and though his oration must be well prepared, it must not seem to be so, and it should possess a certain elevation almost amounting to scorn, and he must take care in speaking not to throw himself on the pity of his judges. For how can he appeal to the pity of others who would not condescend to solicit anything? Such an oration will my hero seem to those who shall diligently study both myself and him, for it was composed by him in the following manner. End of Volume 2, Book 8, Chapters 1 through 6. Volume 2, Book 8, Chapter 7, Part 1, of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F.C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 8, Chapter 7, Part 1. 1. My prince, we are at issue with one another concerning matters of grave moment. For you run such a risk as never autocrat did before you, that namely of being thought to be animated by a wholly unjust hatred of philosophy, while I am exposed to a worse peril than was ever Socrates at Athens. For though his accusers taxed him in their indictment with introducing new beliefs about demons, they never went so far as to call him or think him a demon. Since, however, so grave a peril besets us both, I will not hesitate to tender you the advice of whose excellence I am myself convinced. For since the accuser has plunged us into this struggle, the many have been led to form a false opinion of both myself and of you. They have come to imagine that, in this audience, you will listen only to the counsels of anger, with the result that you will even put me to death, whatever death means, and that I, in turn, shall try to evade this tribunal in some of the many ways there are, and they were, my prince, myriad, of escaping from it. Though these rumors have reached my ears, I have not contracted any prejudice against you, nor have I done you the injury of supposing you will hear my cause otherwise than in accordance with the strictest principles of equity. For in conformity with the laws I submit myself to their pronouncement. And I would advise you also to do the same, for justice demands that you should neither prejudice the case, nor take your seat on the bench with your mind made up to the belief that I have done you any wrong. If you were told that the Armenian, the Babylonian, and other foreign potentates were about to inflict some disaster on you, which must lead to the loss of your empire, you would, I am sure, laugh outright, although they have hosts of cavalry, all kinds of archers, a gold-bearing soil, and, as I know full well, a teeming population. And yet you distrust a philosopher, naked of means of offense, and are ready to believe he is a menace to the autocrat of the Romans. All this on the mere word of an Egyptian sycophant. Never did you hear such tales from Athene, whom you allege to be your guardian spirit, unless indeed, great heavens, their faculty of flattering and falsely accusing others has so increased the influence of these miscreants, that you would pretend that whereas in insignificant matters, such as sore eyes, and avoidance of fevers and inflammation of the bowels, the gods are your apt advisers, manipulating and healing you after the manner of physicians of any one of these maladies you may be suffering from, they, nevertheless, in matters which imperil your throne and your life, give you no counsel either as to the persons you should guard against, or as to the weapons you should employ against them, but, instead of coming to your aid, leave you to the tender mercies of false accusers, whom you regard as the Aegis of Athene, or the hand of Zeus, just because they assert that they understand your welfare better even than do the gods, and that they ever watch over you in the hours of their waking and sleeping, if indeed these wretches can sleep after pouring out such wicked lies and compiling ever and anon whole Iliads such as this one. That they should keep horses and roll theatrically into the forum in chariots drawn by snowy teams, that they should gorge themselves off dishes of silver and gold, parade favorites that cost them 2 or 3 myriad sesterces, that they should go on committing adultery as long as they are not found out, and then, and not before, marry the victims of their lusts when they are caught red-handed, that their splendid success should be hailed with applause, as often as some philosopher or consul, absolutely innocent, falls into their toils, and is put to death by yourself. All this I am willing to concede to the license of these accursed wretches, and to their brazen indifference to the public eye and to the law. But that they should give themselves the airs of superhuman beings, and presume to know better than the gods, I cannot approve or allow, and the mere rumor of it fills me with horror. And if you will allow such things to be, they will perhaps accuse even yourself of offending against established religion. For we may expect the sycophants to concoct such accusations against yourself, so soon as they have exhausted the list of their other victims. I know that my tone is rather that of a censor than that of a defendant. If so, you must pardon me for thus speaking up in behalf of the laws, with the recognition of whose authority by yourself stands and falls that of your own. 2. Who then will be my advocate while I am defending myself? For if I called upon Zeus to help me, under whom I am conscious of having passed my life, they will accuse me of being a wizard and of bringing heaven down to earth. Let us then appeal in this matter to one whom I deny to be dead, although the many assert it. I mean your own father, who held me in the same esteem in which you hold him. For he made you, and was in turn made by me. He, my prince, shall assist me in my defense, because he knows my character much better than yourself. For he came to Egypt before he was raised to the throne, as much to converse with me about the empire as to sacrifice to the gods of Egypt. And when he found me with my long hair and dressed as I am at this moment, he did not ask me a single question about my costume, because he considered that everything about me was well. But he admitted that he had come thither on my account, and after commending me and saying to me things which he would have said to no one else, and having heard from me what he would have heard from no one else, he departed. I most confirmed him in his aspirations for the throne, when others already sought to dissuade him, in no unfriendly spirit, I admit, though you anyhow cannot agree with them, for those who tried to persuade him not to assume the reins of empire were assuredly on their way to deprive you also of the succession to him which you now hold. But by my advice he did not hold himself unworthy, he said, of the kingdom which lay within his grasp, and of making you the heirs thereto. And he fully acknowledged the entire wisdom of my advice, and he was raised himself to the pinnacle of greatness, as in turn he raised yourselves. Now, if he had looked upon me as a wizard, he would never have taken me into his confidence, for he did not come and say such things as this to me: compel the fates, or compel Zeus to appoint me tyrant, or to work miracles and portents in my behalf, and show me the sun rising in the west and setting at the point where it rises. For I should not have thought him a fit person for empire, if he had either considered me as an adept in such art, or resorted to such tricks in pursuit of a crown which it behooved him to win by his virtues alone. More than this, my conversation with him was held publicly in a temple, and wizards do not affect temples of the gods as their places of reunion, for such places are inimical to those who deal in magic, and they cloak their art under the cover of night and of every sort of darkness, so as to preclude their dupes from the use of their eyes and ears. It is true that he also had a private conversation with me, but there were present at it, beside myself, Euphrates and Dion, one of them my bitter enemy, but the other my firmest friend. For may there never come a time when I shall not reckon Dion among my friends. Now I ask you, who would begin to talk wizardry in the presence of wise men, or of men anyhow laying claim to wisdom? And who would not be equally on his guard, both among friends and among enemies, of betraying his villainy? And moreover, our conversation on that occasion was directed against wizards. For you surely will not suppose that your own father, when he was aspiring to the throne, set more confidence in wizards than in himself, or that he got me to put pressure upon heaven, that he might obtain his object, when, on the contrary, he was confident of winning the crown before ever he came to Egypt. And subsequently he had more important matters to talk over with me, namely, the laws and the just acquisition of wealth, and how the gods ought to be worshipped, and what blessings they have in store for those monarchs who govern their people in accordance with the laws. These are the subjects which he desired to learn about, and they are all the direct opposite of wizardry, for if they count for anything at all, there will be an end of the black art. 3. And there is another point, my prince, which merits your attention. The various arts known to mankind, and in spite of the differences of their functions and achievements, are yet all concerned to make money, some earning less, some earning more, and some just enough to live upon. and not only the base mechanic arts, but the rest, those which are esteemed liberal arts, as well as those which only border upon being liberal, and true philosophy is the only exception. And by liberal arts I mean poetry, music, astronomy, the art of the sophist and of the orator, the merely forensic kinds excepted. And by the arts which border upon liberal I mean those of the painter, modeler, sculptor, navigator, agriculturalist, in case the latter waits upon the seasons, for these arts are not very inferior to the liberal professions. And on the other hand, my prince, there are the pseudo-liberal arts of jugglers, which I would not have you confuse with divination, for this is highly esteemed, if it be genuine and tell the truth, though whether it is an art I am not yet sure. But I, anyhow, affirm wizards to be professors of a pseudo-liberal art, for they get men to believe that the unreal is real, and to distrust the real as unreal, and I attribute all such effects to the imaginative fancy of the dupes. For the cleverness of this art is relative to the folly of the persons who are deceived by them, and who offer the sacrifices they prescribe, and its professors are given up wholly to filthy lucre, for all their parade of skill is devised by them in hope of gain, and they are always on the lookout for big fortunes, and they try to persuade people who are passionately attached to something or another that they are capable of getting everything for them. Do you then find me so opulent as to warrant me in supposing that I cultivate this sort of false and illiberal wisdom, the more so as your own father considered me to be above all pecuniary considerations? And to show you that I speak the truth, here is a letter to me from that noble and divine man, who, in it, praises me more especially for my poverty. It runs thus: The autocrat Vespasian, to Apollonius the philosopher, sends greeting. If all men, Apollonius, were disposed to be philosophers in the same spirit as yourself, then the lot no less of philosophy than of poverty would be an extremely happy one, for your philosophy is pure and disinterested, and your poverty is voluntary. Farewell. Let this be your sire's pleading in my behalf, when he thus lays stress upon the disinterestedness of my philosophy, and the voluntariness of my poverty. For I have no doubt he had in mind the episode in Egypt, when Euphrates and several of those who pretended to be philosophers approached him, and in no obscure language begged for money, whereas I myself not only did not solicit him for money, but repudiated them as impostors for doing so. And I also showed an aversion from money from my first youth, for realizing that my patrimony, and it was a considerable property, was at best a transitory toy, I gave it up to my brothers and to my friends to be the poorer of my relatives, so disciplining myself from the very home and hearth to want nothing. I will not dwell upon Babylon and the parts of India beyond the Caucasus and the river Hyphasis, through which I journeyed ever true to myself. But in favor of my life here, and no less of the fact that I have never coveted money, I will invoke the testimony of this Egyptian here, for he accuses me of every sort of evil deed and design, yet we hear nothing from him of how much money I made by these villainies, nor of how much gain I had in view. Indeed, he thinks me such a simpleton as to practice my wizardry for nothing, and whereas others only commit its crimes for much money, he thinks that I commit them for none at all. It is as if I cried my wares to the public in such terms as the following: Come, O ye dupes, for I am a wizard, and I practice my art not for money, but free, gratis, and for nothing. And so you shall earn a great reward, for each of you will go off with his heart's desire, while I shall get away with nothing but dangers and writs of accusation. 4. But without descending to such silly arguments, I would like to ask the accuser which of his counts I ought to take first. And yet, why need I ask him? For at the beginning of his speech he dwelt upon my dress, and by Zeus, upon what I eat and what I do not eat. O divine Pythagoras, do not defend me upon these counts, for we are put upon our trial for a rule of life of which thou wast the discoverer, and of which I am the humble partisan. For the earth, my prince, grows everything for mankind, and those who are pleased to live at peace with the brute creation want nothing. For some fruits they can cull from earth, others they win from her furrows. For she is the nurse of men, and suits the seasons. But these men, as it were, deaf to the cries of Mother Earth, whet their knife against her children in order to get themselves dress and food. Here, then, is something which the Brahmans of India themselves condemned, and which they taught the naked sages of Egypt also to condemn. And from them Pythagoras took his rule of life, and he was the first of Hellenists who had intercourse with the Egyptians. And it was his rule to give up and leave her animals to the earth. But all things which she grows, he declared, were pure and undefiled, and ate of them accordingly, because they were best adapted to nourish both body and soul. But the garments which most men wear, made of hides of dead animals, he declared to be impure, and accordingly clad himself in linen, and on the same principles had his shoes woven of biblus. And what were the advantages which he derived from such purity? Many, and before all the privilege of recognizing his own soul. For he had existed in the age when Troy was fighting about Helen, and he had been the fairest of the sons of Penthus, and the best equipped of them all, yet he died at so young an age as to excite the lamentations even of Homer. Well, after that he passed into several bodies, according to the decree of Adrastea. He transfers the soul from body to body, and then he again resumed the form of man, and was born to Menesarchides of Samos, this time a sage instead of a barbarian, and an Ionian instead of a Trojan, and so immune from death that he did not even forget that he was Euphorbus. I have then told you who was the begetter of my own wisdom, and I have shown that it is no discovery of my own, but an inheritance come to me from another. And as for myself, though I do not condemn or judge those who make it part of their luxury to consume the red-plumaged bird, or the fowls from Phasis, or the land of the Paeonies, which are fattened up for their banquets by those who can deny nothing to their bellies, and though I have never yet brought an accusation against anyone, because they buy fish for their tables at greater prices than grand signors ever gave for their Corinthian chargers, and though I have never grudged anyone his purple garment, nor his soft raiment and Pamphylian tissues, yet I am accused and put upon my trial, O ye gods, because I indulge in asphodel and dessert of dried fruits, and pure delicacies of that kind. 5. Nor even is my mode of dress protected from their calumnies, for the accuser is ready to steal even that off my back, because it has such vast value for wizards. And yet, apart from my contention about the use of living animals and lifeless things, according as he uses one or the other of which I regard a man as impure or pure, in what way is linen better than wool? Was not the latter taken from the back of the gentlest of animals, of a creature beloved of the gods, who do not disdain themselves to be shepherds, and, by Zeus, once held the fleece to be worthy of a golden form, if it was really a god that did so, and if it be not a mere story? On the other hand, linen is grown and sown anywhere, and there is no talk of gold in connection with it. Nevertheless, because it is not plucked from the back of a living animal, the Indians regard it as pure, and so do the Egyptians, and I myself and Pythagoras, on this account, have adopted it as our garb when we are discoursing or praying or offering sacrifice. And it is a pure substance under which to sleep of a night. For those who live as I do, dreams bring the truest of their revelations. 6. Let us next defend ourselves from the attack occasioned by the hair which we formerly wore. For one of the courts of the accusation turns upon the squalor thereof. But surely the Egyptian is not entitled to judge me for this, but rather the dandies, with their yellow and well-combed locks, who seek, by means of them, to inflame the hearts of their lovers and the mistresses of their revels. Let them congratulate and compliment themselves upon their locks and on the myrrh which drips from them. But think me everything that is unattractive, and if a lover of anything, of abstention from love. For I am inclined to address them thus: O ye poor wretches, do not falsely accuse an institution of the Dorians. For the wearing of your hair long has come down from the Lacedaemonians, who affected it in the period when they reached the height of their military fame. And a king of Sparta, Leonidas, wore his hair long in token of his bravery, and in order to appear dignified to his friends, yet terrible to his enemies. For these reasons Sparta wears her hair long no less in his honor than in that of Lycurgus and of Iphitus. And let every sage be careful that the iron knife does not touch his hair, for it is impious to apply it thereto, inasmuch as in his head are all the springs of his senses and all his institutions, and it is the source from which his prayers issue forth, and also his speech, the interpreter of his wisdom. And whereas Empedocles fastened a fillet of deep purple around his hair, and walked proudly about the streets of the Hellenes, composing hymns to prove that he had passed from humanity and was become a god, I only wear my hair dishevelled, and I have never needed to sing such hymns about it, yet am haled before the law courts as a criminal. And what shall I say of Empedocles? Which had he most reason to praise, the man himself or his contemporaries, for their happiness, seeing that they never levelled false accusation against him for such a reason? 7. But let us say no more about my hair, for it has been cut off, and the accusation has been forestalled by the same hatred which inspires the next count, a much more serious one from which I must now defend myself. For it is one calculated to fill not only you, my prince, but Zeus himself with apprehension. For he declares that men regard me as a god, and that those who have been thunderstruck and rendered stark mad by myself proclaim this tenet in public. And yet, before accusing me, there are things which they should have informed us of, to wit, by what discourses, or by what miracles of word or deed, I induced men to pray to me. For I never talked among Hellenes of the goal and origin of my soul's past and future transformations, although I knew full well what they were. Nor did I ever disseminate such opinions about myself, nor go about in search of presages and oracular strains, as is the instinct of candidates for divine honors. Nor do I know of a single city in which a decree was passed that the citizens should assemble and sacrifice in honor of Apollonius. And yet I have been much esteemed in the several cities which asked for my aid, whatever the objects were for which they asked it, and they were such as these: that their sick might be healed of their diseases, that both their initiations and their sacrifices might be rendered more holy, that insolence and pride might be extirpated and the laws strengthened. And whereas the only reward which I obtained in all this was that men were made much better than they were before, they were all so many boons bestowed upon yourself by me. For, as cowherds, if they get the cows into good order, earn the gratitude of their owners, and as shepherds fatten the sheep for the owner's profit, and as beekeepers remove diseases from the hive, so that the owner may not lose his swarm, so also I myself, I think, by correcting the defects of their politics, improved the cities for your benefit. Consequently, if they did regard me as a god, the deception brought profit to yourself, for I am sure they were the more ready to listen to me, because they feared to do that which a god disapproved of. But in fact they entertained no such illusion, though they were aware that there is between man and God a certain kinship which enables him alone of the animal creation to recognize the gods, and to speculate both about his own nature and the manner in which it participates in the divine substance. Accordingly, man declares that his very form resembles God, as it is interpreted by sculptors and painters, and he is persuaded that his virtues come to him from God, and that those who are endowed with such virtues are near to God and divine. But we need not hail the Athenians as the teachers of this opinion, because they were the first to apply to men the titles of just and Olympic beings and the like, though they are too divine, in all probability, to be applicable to man. But we must mention the Apollo and the Pythian temple as their author. For when Lycurgus from Sparta came to his temple, having just penned his code for the regulation of the affairs of Lacedaemon, Apollo addressed him, and weighed and examined the reputation he enjoyed. And at the commencement of his oracle, the god declares that he is puzzled whether to call him a god or a man. But as he advances, he decides in favor of the former appellation, and assigns it to him as being a good man. And yet the Lacedaemonians never forced a lawsuit on this account upon Lycurgus, nor threatened him on the ground that he claimed to be immortal, for he never rebuked the Pythian god for so addressing him, but, on the contrary, the citizens agreed with the oracle, for, I believe, they were already persuaded of the fact before ever it was delivered. And the truth about the Indians and the Egyptians is the following. The Egyptians falsely accuse the Indians of several things, and in particular find fault with their ideas of conduct. But though they do so, they yet approve of the conduct which they have given of the Creator of the universe, and even have taught it to others, though originally it belonged to the Indians. Now this account recognizes God as the Creator of all things, who brought them into being and sustains them, and it declares further that his motive in designing was his goodness. Since then these notions are kindred to one another, I carry the argument further, and declare that good men have in their composition something of God. And by the universe, which depends upon God the Creator, we must understand things in heaven and all things in the sea and on the earth, which are equally open to all men to partake of, though their fortunes are not equal. But there is also a universe dependent on the good man which does not transcend the limits of wisdom, which, I imagine, you yourself, my prince, will allow stands in need of a man fashioned in the image of God. And what is the fashion of this universe? There are undisciplined souls which in their madness clutch at every fashion, and they have laws which are out of date and vain. And there is no good sense among them, but the honors which they pay to the gods really dishonor them, and they are in love with idle chatter and luxury which breed idleness and sloth, the worst of all practical advisers. And there are other souls which are drunken and rush in all directions at once, though their antics lead to nothing, nor could do so, even if they drank all the drugs accounted, as the mandragorous is, to be soporific. Now, if you need a man to administer and care for the universe of such souls, a god sent down by wisdom, for he is able to wean them from the lusts and passions which they rush to satisfy with instincts too fierce for ordinary society, and from their avarice, which is such that they deny they have anything at all unless they can hold their mouths open and have the stream of wealth flow into it. For perhaps such a man as I speak of could even restrain them from committing murder. However, neither I myself, nor even the God who created all things, can wash off them the guilt of that. 8. Let me now, my prince, take the accusation which concerns Ephesus, since the salvation of that city was gained, and let the Egyptian be my judge, according as it best suits his accusation. For this is the sort of thing the accusation is. Let us suppose that among the Scythians or Celts, who live among the rivers Ister and Rhine, a city has been founded every whit as important as Ephesus in Ionia. Here you have a sallyport of barbarians, who refuse to be subject to yourself. Let us then suppose that it was about to be destroyed by a pestilence, and that Apollonius found a remedy and averted it. I imagine that a wise man would be able to defend himself even against such a charge as that, unless indeed the sovereign desires to get rid of his adversaries, not by use of arms, but by plague. For I pray, my prince, that no city may ever be wholly wiped out, either to please yourself or to please me, nor may I ever behold in temples a disease to which those who lie sick should succumb in them. But granted that we are not interested in the affairs of barbarians, and need not restore them to health, since they are our bitter enemies and not at peace with our race. Yet who would desire to deprive Ephesus of her salvation, a city which took its beginnings from that purest of beings, Attis, and which grew in size beyond all other cities of Ionia and Lydia, and stretched herself out to the sea, on the promontory over which she is built, and filled with studious people, both philosophers and rhetoricians, thanks to whom the city owes her strength, not to her cavalry, but to the tens of thousands of her inhabitants in whom she encourages wisdom. And do you think that there is any wise man who would decline to do his best in behalf of such a city, when he reflects that Democritus once liberated the people of Abdera from pestilence, and when he bears in mind the story of Sophocles of Athens, who is said to have charmed the winds when they were blowing unseasonably, and who has heard how Empedocles stayed a cloud in its course when it would have burst over the heads of the people of Arragus? End of Volume 2, Book 8, Chapter 7, Part 1.